Welcome to the Sussex Election 43 show. I'm Brett James. I'm joined today with John Wright, a veteran pollster and principal of Dart Insight. John joined me for the very first show we did almost 4 months ago in the lead up to this election, and we talked then about the shifts that had happened in Canadian public opinion and intentions over the course of sort of 6 months from the beginning of the year. Now, as we are days away from actually voting, John has fresh numbers, and as do many pollsters out there in the field. So in the lead up to the last few days before the election, wanted to talk about what shifted and why and where we're at today. John, off the top, when we talked almost 4 months ago, you were highlighting for our viewers that the underlying indicator to look at that's important maybe a distinction of how you look at this relative to some others in the business is a measure of do they deserve to be reelected? And at the time, there'd been a pretty dramatic downshift for the Liberals relative to the beginning of the year, and we talked about the SNC-Lavalin scandal, etc. What have you seen in terms of how that has played out over the course of the last 4 months?
Well, what's interesting about that question is it's actually asked in two ways. So the first way is it's time for a change. And of course, we would get everybody from Alberta and Manitoba and Saskatchewan kind of going in that direction. And then we look as well as other people, but then you look and you say, you know, the Trudeau government still has lots more work to do. It's done a good job and it deserves to be reelected. And what we've seen over the last, I'd say 8 months or so, is that number dip down towards about the 26% on average deserves to be reelected. I mean, it fills up the tank a little bit to 30, but then it goes back down and back up again. And I have used that as a marker for the last, 15 years or so, because it tends to indicate where the vote might settle around that, as opposed to optimistic predictions that they might come back or something like that. And it was exactly the case with Kathleen Wynne, where the deserve to be reelected was around 19%, and that's where she ended up, even though she started out much higher. So I think it bears it out a little bit. When you look at the polls that have being played out during this campaign, the Liberals really haven't got above 31%. I mean, when you take the average, when you take the polls that I've done, the latest one shows the Liberals at 29%. Last week I had them at 28%. Angus Reid had them at 29%. That's the vote number. So you can see that it's hovered around that bottom end. So I think for the Liberals who were suggesting that there would be some propellant for them to get off the ground, I would remind everybody here that if you go back to the beginning of this campaign and then step back even 5 months before that, the Liberals really haven't got off the mat. I mean, they're still sitting at like 31%. What could cause it to drop down even further is turnout. I mean, that may be it. It may simply be that there are people who are much more motivated against the government to get out and vote. The other thing you and I have talked about before is you look at the youth vote versus the older vote. And the youth vote that propelled Mr. Trudeau into power now is split between the NDP and the Liberals, and that's another issue. So we still have a few days to go, but in some ways, the polling hasn't changed since I was here. The fundamentals are still in place that were there, and we're still fighting on the margins of this.
So the national numbers haven't changed a great deal, but there have been some pretty significant swings, in particular in Quebec, I think. So we talked about Quebec and Ontario being the key to victory for both the Conservatives and the Liberals. Maybe BC, because there are a lot of four-way races and how those split can have an impact. But it was largely the two biggest provinces. And so Quebec, when at the beginning, again, 4 months ago, the NDP had pretty much cratered. I was talking about Mr. Singh looking to hang on maybe to 2, 3, 4 seats. The Bloc was not expected to gain. They had a leader nobody knew. They were in disarray in general. And so it was, I know the Liberals had their eyes set on big gains, and the Conservatives were expecting to gain too. So a lot has changed, and maybe you can reflect on that and why.
Well, it's funny that we're not talking about the Green Party, because sitting at 7 or 8%, Elizabeth May's been nowhere. I mean, she showed up for the debates, but then after that, I mean, she's been put out to sea. what fascinates me about the NDP campaign is a few things. Number one, they're doing it on a shoestring. They've got enormous publicity. Everybody's tracking them, and they're fighting against the big machines. And in the last couple of weeks, you've seen them go from like 14 to 21% of the vote. The second thing is the youth vote, which was with Mr. Trudeau. On a comparative basis, he started out with about 39 to 40% of youth 18 to 34. And Mr. Singh's sitting around 25. And in fact, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen that reverse. So the youth vote is splitting with the Liberals. And we have to remind ourselves that that was the very vote that propelled them into office. I mean, the Trudeau campaign in some ways is very exact and also very cynical. They started out months before the last campaign targeting the millennial. Yeah. They got those folks out. They then governed exactly along those lines. I mean, they dropped a few things here or there, but if you draw a line right through it, they did that same. And then it came out the other side, and it's the same campaign they've run out there. And if you run those things and some things don't go the way you think they should go, and you don't attract the people back, well, then maybe some of the wheels are going to come off that. So I think the bigger thing for Mr. Singh is that there were a couple of points where he became very authentic. And that attracts a lot of young voters nowadays. I mean, they don't have any bias about turbans or people coming from other countries. They like underdogs. There's a whole series of things. It's not really the platform. It's just who he is. And it attracted a lot of support there. The second thing was there were a lot of Liberals who were looking for a place to go, that they didn't want to vote with Mr. Trudeau for whatever reason, and they just were soft Liberals and said, I don't want to give it to the sheer Tories, I want to go somewhere else. And so Mr. Singh suddenly becomes an option with that. And will it, maintain itself until the end of the day? Probably, yeah. And where will it have its greatest impact? In British Columbia, where they're going to fight it out there. I don't know how much it's going to have an impact on the East Coast, because as we recall, early on, we had a whole lot of NDP candidates flip over to the Greens, and right. I would say, how's that working for you so far? But I think I guess that sets that up for a further discussion, because I'm calling this more like the Rubik's Cube election. And the reason for that is just what you said. I mean, we've got the Maritimes where we had flipping of candidates, and now it's a three-way fight there, not necessarily with the Greens. We had a sudden spike of the Bloc Québécois, which is mowing Mr. Trudeau's lawn. And Andrew Scheer may keep those seats there, but the NDP creeping back into certain areas of Quebec. Ontario, much as we started out with, is up and down. Some weeks it's up for the Liberals, other weeks it's down. You look at the 905, my polling from 48 hours ago showed that the Conservatives were winning in the 905. But then you're dealing with a 200 sample size, and so you kind of, make it go back,
Sure.
What is it? Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, you kind of look at it and go, nothing's really changed. And you move over to the West Coast, and certainly there is stuff in play on the West Coast. So here you've got geography, you've got age, then you've got turnout on top of that, where older voters turn out more than younger voters, angrier voters turn out more than complacent voters. We have all of these pieces at play, and yet there still is an expectation that someone who does the numbers, like I do, is going to put out a view. So my view was to actually, for the first time in many years, was just to lay this up on the green, just to wedge it up onto the green. Now, I'm not going for the pin shot, but if you read how I wrote this, it was much like I've just described, but said that Mr. Scheer has the chance, when you look at these numbers from the other night, to have the most seats. Does that mean a majority or a minority? It depends on those other factors. And I think anybody who says otherwise, I mean, we might be surprised on election night that there's a sudden breakout somewhere. I don't know, but I've not seen an election like this before, where you've got those permutations that come into play. Usually there's one or two things you can point to and say, there you go. In fact, when I was with my colleague Daryl Bricker, when we used to work at Ipsos, we used to have these great big conference style breakfasts, and it was they said, the call. Right. And it was almost like you were some kind of disciple, where you were taking the numbers and saying, this is the way it's going to be, which right. in many ways gave us not such a great name because of what happened in a couple of afterwards. But the reality was that I think given this, I'm going to make the call right in the middle. I'm not sure.
It's that close. So, if I'm interested to know if there's been a turning point. Like you said, the national numbers haven't moved a ton, but there's been a lot of movement underneath that.
Correct.
And my own, you talked about the authenticity, I think you used the term, of Jagmeet Singh. And for me, it was his response to the well-meaning person, maybe with some racial undertones in Quebec, who approached him on the street, suggested he should get rid of his turban. His response to that, his response to the Trudeau blackface scandal, showed a level of maturity and the type of response Canadians want to see from a leader, I think. And then his performance in the debates, in particular the English language debate. I have a 16-year-old, and she and her classmates are pretty civically minded. They're paying attention, and to a person, they would say, we like that guy. Again, not looking at the platform necessarily.
Correct.
Just he connects and he resonates with them in a way that maybe Trudeau did in 2015, but Singh is now. Is that what has turned around his campaign? Is it those events? Is it something else, or is it not of his own doing? Is it more disaffection with Trudeau?
That's a really good question. I'm going to say that it's more about him than it is about people moving to him because of somebody else. I mean, there's a fine point on it. You look, if you're going to vote, you want to look for a safe harbor to be in that you can identify with. And I go one further. I think the example that I recall being the most authentic was when he was asked a question about Indigenous water and clean water, and he turned it back and said, would we be having these discussions if we were talking about Vancouver or other things? To me and my household and my teenagers, that's the note that hit. It was like a tuning fork, and they said, yes, absolutely. So Jagmeet Singh, again, with almost no advertising, all self-generated, has presented a face of the new Canada that most young people know and accept nowadays, and they see in their own classrooms. But he's been authentic.
Yeah.
He has been who he is, and surprisingly so, because we didn't know him beforehand. But it's reflected not just in the youth vote, but in the esteem that voters out there have given him on the most respected role, being higher than the others. And I think he's gained an enormous amount. Whereas going into this election, I think people who were part of the NDP might have said, this is over. I mean, we're going to lose everything, and he's going to be out. We're going to have to go back to square one. No, they've got something here that even in the last few days, he's been very calculated in terms of what may happen if we get into a minority parliament. So he's been able to wisen up on the campaign trail, and I think he's done a really great job.
Similarly, what's your view of what happened in Quebec? What did Blanchette catch onto that has made such a difference for the Bloc? And is it how he's handled himself and what he's done, or is it about others and others not catching fire? Like, I think, Scheer, viewed that he had an opportunity to grow in Quebec. I think the Liberals thought they were going to grow in Quebec, and neither has happened.
Yeah, and I don't live there, and I always remember someone in advertising telling me that if you don't diaper them in the morning, you really don't know what they want for supper. I mean, it's you have to live and be immersed in it. So I say, as an Anglophone, I'll give you my outside view. Number one, Quebecers want to be with the winner, and they want what they want. So Mr. Blanchette represents all of that in saying, look, I'm just here for Quebecers, and I can form a government with either of you if you're in minority, but I just want what I want. Okay, so that's fine. He's charismatic as well. He happens to also be living in a province where the premier of that province is the most popular in the country. Next to Scott Moe of Saskatchewan. So, I mean, there's all those pieces there. He distinguished himself, Mr. Blanchette, in the first debate, the French language debate. In the English debate, he even did, and then in the French debate afterwards. So we saw that. So there's a few of those pieces. I think Bill 21 has a fair bit to do with that as well. I'm not sure I'm missing much, but I think that sometimes, again, in other parts of the country, when you've tired of Mr. Trudeau or Mr. Scheer, but mainly Mr. Trudeau, who's been defending his actions versus SNC Lavalin and all of that, and being strict, sticking to that core message all along, people get tired of it and want to see something different. And I think there's a fair bit of that that's gone through there. Again, I would turn to those who were in the Liberal Party and say that for all of those months around Jody Wilson-Raybould, around the SNC drama, SNC-Lavalin drama, around all of that. How's it working for you so far? And the answer is not. So I think there's a fair bit of that in all of that propellant.
I think every voter, every province wants somebody who's going to stand up for what they're interested in, but Quebec always seems to be more so than the rest of the country, and it certainly seems to me that Blanchette has captured. If the bottom line is who's going to do the best job for my province, clearly he's staked out that ground, and they've lost faith that even a native Quebecer like Trudeau is going to be the one that's going to deliver for them.
But let me take you down a different road than we were even going to talk to.
Sure.
Because I don't think people are really talking about this. Let's assume for a moment that Mr. Trudeau gets a minority government and he's able to do that. I mean, what's sitting across the table from him? I mean, he says, he can go and negotiate on doctors. Everybody got a doctor, all that stuff. Okay, so Mr. Ford, Mr. Kenney, Mr. Pollster,
Higgs.
You're looking across the table at I've gone blank here for a minute. Scott Moe. You're looking at a whole series of premiers that oppose you in the first place. So if you think you've got a negotiating position, it's going to not work out that well. But secondly, you know what I'm going to be polling on if that happens? I'm going to be polling on sovereignty. I'm going to be digging out all of those. I've already started to. All of those questions go back to 1995, 94, 93. Where we ask about the role of provincial powers and the ability to expand those powers. Now, I'm going to say on two sides. Number one, if Mr. Trudeau wins in one way or the other, I think Alberta's going to go absolutely ballistic. And they've waited for so long, and they've sent out a lot of warnings, and you say, well, what does that mean? Well, it says, well, Jason Kenney's got a lot of premiers here versus one guy who's prime minister. If, in fact, Andrew Scheer comes up with the most, I think the expectation may be that there be some changes, constitutionally or otherwise, to equate with Quebec. That might get the support of the Bloc Québécois. Why would they go against that? Right. So it may turn from simply being, this is a discussion about pipelines, where if Mr. Scheer wins, then all of a sudden it's basically we can send the pipeline out because he'll be in control of it as long as we get it through British Columbia and out to the ports. But the other thing is that it opens up a whole different discussion now based on the substantive powers of the provinces and the ability to restructure that whole dynamic relative to the powers that Quebec has. And I would suspect, maybe short of a constitutional issue, where we're all around the table. Remember those times when René Lévesque and all those people were around the table? We all remember those things. I suspect that those questions that I've pulled out over the last few days, if that happens otherwise, on either side, I'm going to be using them and trying to figure out what the parallels are between those groups of people from now versus then.
Well, it's a type of approach to federalism that I think, Harper moved the dial in his days too, and which to the satisfaction of the provinces, the way he handled all of that, by giving them more leeway, by stepping back from some of the more centralized role that the federal government had been playing before that. So if you were to extend that, I think that there's a correlation to draw too, that this type of division, which is happening right now, and I worry about for the country, it had dissipated, right? The Bloc was weakened because Quebec was getting the kind of autonomy that it wanted. So the raison d'etre just wasn't there in the same way. Similarly, because there was much more support for our resource sector, they didn't have the alienation in the West. But again, that what you're speaking to, I think, there was a very different dynamic then. And if Scheer's approach was to continue down that road, I could see how that could be successful in getting provinces on side, if he has the opportunity. And we don't know. And it seems to me that he has a more difficult road in forming a workable minority than Trudeau might, just based on the platform end of things. But that may not be fair either.
Well, you and I know that if you were in the Bloc and I was in the Conservatives and we had some differences, we would be able to agree on 3 or 4 things that would allow us to work together and put the other stuff off to the side. This is about power. This is about being able to govern something. Yeah. And so I think that Mr. Scheer, if he comes up a little short, and I know that the big debate nowadays is whether, the Governor General says to Mr. Trudeau, you can form first versus him. We've gone through this many, many times. I think at the end of the day, it'll be finding common ground on both sides of the sword lengths. Like the Liberals and the Democrats and the Greens will find some common ground there. It will be much like the Accord at Queen's Park that we've seen a number of times and in other provinces where they basically say, look, for the next 2 years, we'll get along with each other and then we'll set each other to go back up again.
Right.
So, but I think you've touched on something about the national situation, and let me bring it back again. We've witnessed over the last number of years, even with the purchasing of the pipeline, a perception that in fact, if the West didn't vote for the Liberals, then they didn't get anything. Like, why should I even put my plane wheels down in your province if you were going to deliver every seat to the Conservatives?
Right.
I think that's a lack of, in one sense, being magnanimous and doing something for that country. It doesn't always have to be about pipelines. What it really is about is what Mr. Scheer is talking about, and that's the affordability of living. And if you just ignore one or two parts of this country continuously, you do so at your peril. Like, there will be repercussions of that. I think what we're dealing with right now is a buildup of that. And there's a piece on the top here that if it comes off, there's going to be quite an explosion. Mr. Kenney has it underneath him, and he's going to have to channel that in some way. And I don't know what that is, but whatever it's going to be, it's either going to be a huge sigh of relief with expectations, or it's going to be a huge volcano of anger that they've been betrayed, and I'm not sure what that means.
905. So you've...
Yeah.
I want to focus there because I think it's going to tell the tale on Monday night, likely, and we thought so months ago. But it's been all over the map, and as you said, with not a big sample size, you're showing the Conservatives currently in the lead. So volatile that you really can't tell.
Well, part of this you have to blame on the polling because what you'd really like to do in the United States is actually only poll the 8 to 10 states that matter, based on what could happen, as opposed to the rest of the country. In this, you really do want to have a 2,000 sample of the 905 rather than the 200 sample, because when that happens, if the wind blows certain nights, you get it moving one way or the other. But let me say this. The one thing I noticed this past week was the advertising on radio that Mr. Scheer was running. There was a tone change, and it moved from what I would call the tone of hope. There were a number, the music was nice and it was coming in and it was that sort of. Over the last couple of days, it's turned again into carbon tax, gas, and all that sort of stuff. So here's the dynamic playing out. You've got this donut ring around the CN Tower made up of commuters. You've got them of people who are hardworking immigrant families. I mean, they're not of the 1930s version, they're of the new version who came to this country and got jobs and built homes and things like that. But this has turned out to be a rather fickle area that moves back and forth for both the provincial and the federal campaigns. And I really do believe that, either we're going to get through the first 45 minutes of the election where we sweep over the 905 and we see it all of a sudden plotting up blue, or we're going to see it as a checkerboard, and we're going to have to wait till it comes out the other end of the country. If you look at the polls that are coming out leading up to this weekend, I had the 905 ahead, but I could only report it in as much as Ontario itself was ahead for the Conservatives. Somebody else may find in the next 48 hours that it's competitive or behind. The reality is it's in play. It is always in play. It's never a sure thing. And maybe it is the Quebec 2-hour province of Ontario, as the Bloc Québécois is there. They know what they want. They want to be given certain things that they want because they're just outside of that band. I think they're still in play today, but I'd say they're leaning more to the Conservatives based on the ads that they're putting out.
But it's also a part of the country where the Singh factor, the NDP, there's a lot of three-way races in there, or at least they can draw enough where they're going to hurt the Liberals and potentially allow the Conservatives to win.
But we have to remember that there are certain parts of the 905 that have deep, East Indian populations there. I mean, there was no mistake that in Brampton the other night they had the biggest crowd out for Mr. Singh, and that's where the population is the greatest. It represents, his ancestors and the places that he's come from. But it's not that way when you move to Whitby and the 905 into Pickering. I mean, it's very different that way. That's what makes this somewhat unpredictable. I don't think I've seen a raft of NDP candidates elected in the 905. Honestly, it's been either red or blue.
Right.
But maybe Patrick Brown, who was able to get a lot of people from Brampton in to buy, tickets and win that leadership, it's the same group that if they all banded together, maybe Mr. Singh does have an NDP seat there, or a couple of them. That's what makes this unpredictable.
But my point was really 4 months ago, they were so low in the polls that it didn't do enough to bleed
point
from the Liberals, excuse me, and allow the Conservatives to be winning those seats. It may make that difference now.
No, I think, I understand exactly what you're saying, because what it is it presents an extra driver that splits the vote. And the question then, I'll come back to this and say, look, I think this is a game going to come down to turnout. When you're looking at campaigns that are essentially, 31, 29, 21 on the top line, that's hardly enthusiastic. And I think, again, when you look at people, either they are going to go out to the polls because they want to throw this government out, or they want to save it because they identify with it. That's great. But how many of them are going to do that is the real question in this campaign. And so I think all your points are valid, but I think turnout may be even higher this election campaign. But angry people also go to the polls as much as hopeful people. And in this campaign with the blackface and a series of other things, I'm not sure that it's about hope.
Well, I worry about the results and what they mean in terms of being able to govern and govern well. I do. There is an argument for minorities and whether, like a minority government, and whether or not that's actually healthier for the country and collaboration, etc. But whatever it means, it's going to be for political watchers like ourselves. It's going to be a fascinating night on October the 21st.
Well, let me just end with this. I mean, it is quite possible that every poll that's and we're all in the same bandwidth. Who knows when it comes to election day that somebody might just break out. Everything that we've talked about here becomes a willing ingredient to something happening that was unexpected. And I'm not making excuses for any of the polling. What I am saying, and I think any other person doing the numbers should be looking at, is what we started out with. The permutations of each region, the permutations of the split votes and the issues per those regions, the permutations of turnout and age. Yeah. I haven't seen anything like this I can't remember. This is going to be a very interesting evening.
Looking forward to it. And thank you again for joining us on our show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.